The loudest laughter I ever heard came seconds after I signed my own divorce papers. My name is Lucas Bennett, and if you had walked into my father-in-law's house on that Christmas Eve, you would have assumed I was the loser in the story. The living room glowed beneath twinkling lights and carefully decorated garlands. Christmas music drifted softly from hidden speakers. A massive tree stood in the corner covered with ornaments collected over decades. Family photographs lined the walls. Children ran through the hallways carrying new toys while adults gathered around tables covered with holiday food. From the outside, it looked like the perfect American Christmas. Inside, my marriage was ending. Caroline and I had been married for 14 years. We met in college, built a life together, and spent years chasing dreams that often seemed just out of reach. At least, that was how I remembered it. Somewhere along the way, our relationship changed. The conversations became shorter. The warmth became colder. The partnership slowly turned into something neither of us recognized. Even then, I never expected what happened that night. Everyone had gathered in the main living room after dinner. My father-in-law sat near the fireplace. Caroline's mother was passing around dessert plates. Several cousins were laughing over old family stories. Snow drifted gently outside the large front windows. It felt like a scene from a holiday movie. Then Caroline stood up holding a manila envelope. At first, I assumed it contained Christmas cards or family photos. Instead, she walked directly toward me. The room gradually fell silent. I still remember the expression on her face. Calm, confident, certain. She stopped in front of me and handed me the envelope. "Lucas," she said, "I think it is time." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Slowly, I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents inside. Divorce papers. For a moment, the words blurred together. 14 years reduced to several sheets of paper. Around me, nobody spoke. Everyone seemed to be waiting for my reaction. Caroline folded her arms and remained standing. The silence stretched across the room. I looked up and searched her face for some sign of hesitation. There was none, only expectation. The truth is that I already knew our marriage was struggling. I knew Caroline had become distant. I knew something was wrong. What I did not expect was for this moment to happen in front of her entire family. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages. The room remained silent. Then someone near the back laughed nervously. Another person chuckled. A cousin whispered something that caused a few others to smile. The atmosphere shifted. What began as tension slowly transformed into entertainment. They thought they were watching a man get what he deserved. I glanced around the room and realized something painful. Not a single person looked concerned about me. Not one person asked whether I was okay. Not one person wondered why Caroline had chosen Christmas Eve for this announcement. To them, the outcome was already decided. I reached for the pen resting on the coffee table. My vision blurred as emotion threatened to overwhelm me. 14 years of memories flooded through my mind. The first apartment, the late nights, the sacrifices, the promises. Everything seemed impossibly distant now. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Someone laughed again. I signed the final page and handed the documents back to Caroline. The room erupted with conversation almost immediately. It was as though everyone had been holding their breath waiting for the show to end. Caroline accepted the papers and thanked me. Then she walked away to join her family. I sat there for another minute listening to their voices blend with the Christmas music playing softly in the background. Finally, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside into the cold night air. Snowflakes drifted beneath the glow of the porch lights. Behind me, laughter continued inside the house. What none of them knew was that I had just made the easiest decision of my life. Because while everyone in that room believed they understood exactly who I was, they were about to discover how wrong they had been. The days after Christmas felt strangely quiet. Not because people stopped talking, but because they started talking without realizing I could hear them. My phone remained unusually active during the first week after the holiday. Messages arrived from relatives, mutual friends, and people who had attended the gathering. Most were carefully worded. Some expressed sympathy. Others offered vague encouragement. What struck me was how few people actually asked what happened. They already believed they knew. Caroline had controlled the narrative for so long that most people simply accepted her version without question. According to the stories circulating through the family, our marriage had failed because I lacked ambition. I was too comfortable, too ordinary, too unwilling to keep up with Caroline's growing success. It was a convenient explanation because it required nobody to examine the details. It allowed everyone to feel confident about their judgment. The funny thing about assumptions is that they often reveal more about the people making them than the person being judged. 3 days after Christmas, I stopped by a coffee shop near downtown Denver where I had been meeting clients and friends for years. Snow still covered the sidewalks. Holiday decorations remained visible in storefront windows. As I waited for my coffee, I noticed Caroline's cousin Nathan sitting at a nearby table. He waved me over with an expression that seemed somewhere between curiosity and amusement. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes before he finally leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Why did you sign so fast?" The question surprised me because it was the first honest question anyone had asked since Christmas Eve. Not why the marriage failed. Not what happened. Just why I accepted the papers so easily. I stirred my coffee and smiled. Because fighting for someone who no longer wants to be there rarely changes the outcome. Nathan seemed disappointed by the answer. I think he expected anger. Most people did. Anger is easier to understand than calm. Before leaving, he shook my hand and said he hoped everything worked out. What he did not realize was that things were already working out better than he imagined. Back at home, I continued settling into a routine that felt unfamiliar but peaceful. The house was quieter now. Caroline spent most evenings with her parents or friends. When she was home, our conversations remained polite and brief. There was no dramatic hostility, no arguments, just distance. One evening, I overheard her speaking with her mother on speakerphone in the kitchen. Neither realized I was in the adjoining room. Her mother laughed while discussing future plans after the divorce. A new condominium, new opportunities, new possibilities. The conversation carried an underlying assumption that everything ahead would be simple, guaranteed, predictable. Listening from the other room, I noticed something else. Not once did they mention the years behind us, the sacrifices, the support, the history. It was as if my role in the story had already been reduced to a footnote. That realization should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it brought clarity. People reveal what they value when they think a chapter is ending. Over the next several days, additional conversations reached me through mutual friends. Caroline's family openly celebrated the divorce. Some joked that she was finally free to live the life she deserved. Others suggested she had carried me for years. The comments would have devastated me once. Now they simply confirmed what I had suspected. None of them truly knew me. More importantly, none of them seemed interested in knowing me. One snowy Saturday afternoon, I sat alone in my study reviewing old journals and notebooks from earlier periods of my career. As page after page passed beneath my fingertips, a different story began emerging. Names, meetings, introductions, recommendations, opportunities, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but eventually changed the direction of entire careers. Careers connected to people in Caroline's family. For the first time, I found myself wondering how many doors had quietly opened over the years without anyone ever asking who unlocked them. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the neighborhood. Inside, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the growing stack of notebooks on my desk. Everyone in Caroline's family believed they understood exactly who I was. The truth was far more interesting. And very soon, they were going to discover that the quietest person in the room is often the one who sees the entire picture. Looking back, I think the biggest mistake Caroline's family made was assuming influence always announces itself. Most people imagine powerful connections as something visible. They picture private jets, exclusive clubs, or flashy business dinners. Real influence rarely looks like that. More often, it looks like a phone call made at the right time, an introduction nobody remembers, or a recommendation quietly offered without expecting recognition. During the weeks that followed Christmas, I found myself revisiting chapters of my life that I had not thought about in years. One snowy afternoon, I opened an old storage cabinet in my study and pulled out several boxes filled with notebooks, business cards, meeting notes, and journals. At first, I was simply organizing. Then I started reading. Every page reminded me of a life that very few people had ever seen. Years earlier, before Caroline's career took off, I spent most of my time building relationships. Not because I wanted status, but because I genuinely enjoyed helping people solve problems. Over time, those relationships grew into something valuable. Executives, entrepreneurs, investors, community leaders, People from different industries who trusted me because I always delivered on my word. I never talked about those relationships at family gatherings. Nobody asked, and I never felt the need to impress anyone. As I sorted through the boxes, a familiar name caught my attention. It belonged to a regional director at a company where Caroline's younger brother, Eric, had worked for nearly 6 years. I smiled as a memory surfaced. Years ago, Eric had been struggling to find stable employment after college. Caroline was worried about him. Her parents were worried too. One evening, she asked if I knew anyone who might be willing to interview him. Within a week, I arranged a meeting through an old contact. Eric performed well and earned the opportunity on his own merits afterward, but without that introduction, the door never would have opened. The funny thing was that I never mentioned my role again. Over the years, the story evolved until everyone seemed to believe Eric simply discovered the opportunity himself. I was perfectly fine with that. Then I found another name. Caroline's cousin Melissa. Several years earlier, she launched a small consulting business. During the difficult first year, she needed guidance and introductions. I connected her with 3 people I trusted. Those conversations eventually led to her first major clients. Again, I never asked for credit. Again, the story changed with time. As I continued reading through old notes, similar examples appeared everywhere. Caroline's uncle receiving advice during a complicated business transition. A family friend finding an investor through one of my contacts. A recommendation letter that helped someone secure a leadership position. None of these moments felt significant when they happened. They were simply opportunities to help. Yet seeing them together created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. For years, Caroline's family viewed me as ordinary because they only measured visible achievements. They never bothered looking beneath the surface. That evening, I attended a small networking event downtown. The gathering was held inside a historic hotel decorated with lingering holiday lights. As I moved through the room, I exchanged greetings with people I had known for decades. Conversations flowed naturally. Several attendees asked about my life. A few had already heard rumors about the divorce. What surprised me was how many expressed genuine concern. Not curiosity, concern. They asked how I was doing. They listened carefully. They treated me with respect. Driving home later that night, I realized something important. The way Caroline's family saw me was never an accurate reflection of reality. It was simply a reflection of their limited perspective. Back at home, the house was quiet. Caroline was spending another evening with relatives. I sat alone in the study and looked at the collection of journals spread across my desk. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I understood why I felt so calm. I was not losing my identity. I was rediscovering it. And while Caroline's family continued celebrating what they believed was a victory, they remained completely unaware that many of the opportunities they took for granted had roots leading directly back to the man they had spent years underestimating. January slowly turned into February, and something interesting began happening. Nobody announced it. Nobody recognized it at first. The changes were small enough to dismiss individually, but noticeable when viewed together. It started with Caroline's cousin Melissa. One afternoon, she called Caroline frustrated about a business opportunity that suddenly disappeared. A company she expected to sign with had chosen another consultant without explanation. According to Caroline, Melissa spent nearly an hour complaining about bad timing and poor communication. A few days later, Caroline's brother Eric experienced a similar disappointment. A promotion he felt confident about went to someone else. Again, there was no scandal, no conspiracy, no dramatic event, just a door quietly remaining closed. At first, nobody connected these situations. Why would they? Life is full of disappointments. Opportunities come and go every day. Yet as the weeks passed, similar stories continued appearing. A business introduction never materialized. A meeting was postponed indefinitely. An investor stopped returning calls. None of these events were catastrophic. They were simply unusual. One snowy Thursday afternoon, I was having lunch with an old friend named Robert at a restaurant overlooking downtown Denver. We had known each other for almost 20 years. During our conversation, he mentioned receiving a call from someone connected to Caroline's family. Apparently, they were seeking advice regarding a business project. Robert smiled as he stirred his coffee. "I was surprised when they called," he said. "I assumed they would have reached out through you." I laughed softly. "Those days are probably over." Robert studied me for a moment. "Do they know?" I knew exactly what he meant. "Not yet," I replied. He nodded slowly. The conversation moved on, but his question stayed with me. Do they know? The honest answer was no. Caroline's family still viewed the world through the same assumptions they held for years. They believed opportunities simply appeared. They believed relationships maintained themselves. They believed credibility was automatic. They never stopped to consider how many invisible connections existed beneath the surface. That evening, I returned home to find Caroline sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone. She looked distracted, concerned. For the first time in months, she initiated a genuine conversation. Have you talked to Melissa recently? She asked. Not in quite a while. Caroline sighed. She is having a rough month. I nodded sympathetically. Then she mentioned Eric's situation. Then another relative. Then a family friend. One story after another. Listening carefully, I noticed a common pattern. Each problem involved relationships, referrals, introductions, or opportunities. The exact areas where trust and reputation mattered most. Caroline rubbed her temples and shook her head. It is strange, she said. Everything just feels different lately. Different. The word lingered in the air between us. I almost responded. Almost explained what she was beginning to notice. Instead, I remained silent. Because the truth was simple. Nothing had changed. The only difference was that people were finally experiencing life without certain invisible advantages they never realized existed. Later that night, I sat alone in my study reviewing old correspondence. Emails, letters, notes from meetings. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. Over the years, I had spent thousands of hours building trust. Not transactions. Trust. That trust eventually became a network. And that network quietly benefited countless people around me. Not because I planned it. Not because I wanted influence. Simply because helping others often creates opportunities that ripple outward in ways nobody notices. Outside the window, snow drifted beneath the glow of streetlights. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Inside, I found myself reflecting on a lesson most people learn too late. The most valuable things in life are often invisible. Reputation, integrity, relationships, credibility. People rarely appreciate them until they are gone. And somewhere across the city, Caroline's family was beginning to ask questions they had never considered before. Questions that would eventually lead them directly back to the person they spent years dismissing as ordinary. By the middle of February, curiosity had quietly replaced confidence within Caroline's family. Nobody admitted it openly, but the signs were impossible to miss. The certainty they displayed after Christmas was fading. Questions were beginning to appear. One Saturday afternoon, Caroline's parents hosted a small family lunch. I was no longer attending those gatherings, but information has a way of traveling through families faster than people realize. Later that evening, Caroline mentioned the event while we sorted through paperwork related to the divorce. According to her, the conversation spent less time celebrating the future and more time discussing recent disappointments. Melissa was still struggling to replace the client she expected to sign. Eric had learned that another promotion opportunity would likely be delayed. An uncle who relied heavily on referrals was noticing fewer calls than usual. None of these situations were disasters. They were simply unusual enough to make people uncomfortable. Caroline seemed frustrated by the growing negativity. Everyone is acting like the sky is falling, she said while organizing documents at the kitchen table. It is just a rough couple of months. I nodded without offering an opinion. Technically, she was right. Difficult seasons happen. Yet what fascinated me was not the setbacks themselves. It was the fact that people were finally paying attention to how opportunities arrived in the first place. For years, success had seemed automatic. Now they were starting to examine the machinery behind it. A week later, I received a phone call from someone I had not spoken with in nearly 3 years. It was Daniel Foster, an executive I met through a leadership conference long ago. We spent several minutes catching up before he casually mentioned meeting Eric at a recent business event. Good guy, Daniel said. I was surprised he did not realize how we originally connected. I smiled. Most people never ask. Daniel laughed. That seems to happen a lot where you are concerned. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my study reflecting on that observation. It was true. Most people never asked. Not because they were unkind, but because they assumed they already knew the answer. Assumptions are efficient. Curiosity requires effort. That evening brought another interesting development. Caroline returned home looking thoughtful. She set her purse down near the front door and remained unusually quiet through dinner. Eventually, She looked up from her plate. Melissa called me today. I waited. She was talking to one of her clients about networking, and somehow your name came up. I continued listening. Apparently, the client knew you. There was something different in Caroline's voice. Not suspicion, not accusation, something closer to confusion. She seemed to be encountering information that did not fit her existing understanding of reality. That happens sometimes, I said calmly. She studied me for several seconds. A lot of people seem to know you. I smiled faintly. I have been around for a while. The conversation ended there, but I could tell her mind was working. Small pieces were beginning to move into place. The following week, another piece appeared. Eric reached out unexpectedly and asked if we could meet for coffee. It was the first time he had contacted me directly since Christmas. We met at a quiet cafe near the edge of downtown. He looked uncomfortable from the moment he arrived. After exchanging pleasantries, he finally leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Years ago, when I got my first position at Hawthorne Industries, how exactly did that happen?" For a moment, I simply looked at him. The question represented far more than curiosity. It represented the beginning of understanding. I took a sip of coffee and answered honestly. "Your interview got you the job, but the interview happened because someone I knew agreed to meet with you." Eric sat silently. The expression on his face shifted as old memories reorganized themselves into a different picture. It was not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet adjustment of perspective. By the time we left the cafe, I could sense something changing. The questions that had started as isolated doubts were becoming a pattern. And once people begin following a pattern, they often discover truths that have been sitting in plain sight for years. By early March, the questions were no longer isolated. They were spreading. What began with Eric's curiosity had quietly reached other members of Caroline's family. Nobody was accusing anyone of anything. Nobody was uncovering a scandal. The truth was much simpler than that. People were finally tracing the origins of opportunities they had always taken for granted. And every road seemed to lead back to the same place. One afternoon, I received a call from Melissa. The conversation surprised me because we had not spoken directly in several months. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Lucas, years ago, when I launched my consulting business, how did you know those 3 clients you introduced me to?" I leaned back in my chair and smiled softly. "Through people I worked with over the years." There was a brief silence. I always thought Caroline found those connections. The comment did not bother me. In fact, it perfectly illustrated the problem. Over time, assumptions become memories. People stop remembering how things actually happened and start remembering the version that feels most convenient. Melissa thanked me for the conversation and ended the call. Yet I could tell she was processing much more than a simple answer. The following week brought another unexpected encounter. While attending a leadership breakfast downtown, I ran into Caroline's Uncle Richard. He approached me with an expression I had never seen before. Respect mixed with uncertainty. After exchanging greetings, he asked whether we could sit together for a few minutes. During the conversation, he mentioned a business transition he experienced nearly 8 years earlier. At the time, he believed an investor simply happened to take interest in his company. What he recently discovered was that the introduction came through a chain of relationships that started with me. I watched his face carefully as he explained the realization. He was not angry. He was confused, like someone discovering that a familiar building contained hidden rooms he never knew existed. "Why did you never say anything?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. "Because it was never about me." Richard sat quietly. For years, he had viewed me as the quiet husband sitting in the corner during family gatherings. Suddenly, that image no longer matched reality. Around the same time, Caroline began changing as well. The shift was subtle at first. She asked more questions. She listened more carefully. One evening, while we reviewed additional divorce paperwork, she looked up from the documents and asked something unexpected. "How many people do you actually know?" I laughed softly. "That depends on what you mean." "I mean professionally." I thought for a moment. "Enough." She stared at me for several seconds before returning to the paperwork. The conversation ended there, but I knew what was happening. Caroline was beginning to see pieces of a person she thought she already understood. The most revealing moment came later that month. Eric invited me to lunch again. This time he arrived carrying a notebook. At first I assumed it contained work notes. Instead, he opened it and revealed a list of names. Executives. business owners, community leaders, people connected to various opportunities his family had benefited from over the years. One by one, he had been tracing connections. One by one, he discovered a recurring pattern. My name, not at the center of every story, not as the hero, simply present, quietly helping, quietly connecting, quietly supporting. Eric looked up from the notebook and shook his head. Nobody knew. His words hung in the air between us. Nobody knew. He was right. They did not. Because they never looked. They saw a calm man who avoided attention and assumed there was nothing worth noticing. The irony was almost amusing. The very quality that allowed me to build meaningful relationships over decades was the same quality that convinced others I lacked influence altogether. As spring approached and the snow slowly disappeared from the city, Caroline's family continued following the trail of forgotten history. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle. Each conversation challenged assumptions that had existed for years. And for the first time since that Christmas Eve, I sensed something remarkable happening. The story they told about me was beginning to crack. Not because I defended myself. Not because I demanded recognition. Simply because the truth has a strange habit of revealing itself when people finally decide to ask the right questions. By April, the story that Caroline's family had repeated for years could no longer survive contact with reality. Nobody announced a dramatic revelation. There was no family meeting, no emotional confrontation, no shocking document placed on a table. The truth emerged the way most important truths do, one conversation at a time. Each person discovered a different piece, and eventually those pieces formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. It began when Eric shared what he learned with his parents. At first they resisted. Nobody enjoys realizing they have misunderstood someone for years. Yet the evidence continued growing. Melissa had her own discoveries. Richard had his. Other relatives quietly started asking questions of people outside the family. Former colleagues, business contacts, community leaders. The answers they received were surprisingly consistent. Everywhere they looked, they encountered the same description of me. Reliable, trusted, respected, generous. The words surprised them because they did not match the version of me they discussed around family dinner tables. One evening, Caroline's father called unexpectedly. During 14 years of marriage, we had never been especially close. We were always polite, but our conversations rarely extended beyond sports, weather, or family events. This call felt different from the moment I answered. After a few minutes of small talk, he became quiet. "Lucas," he said, "there is something I have been meaning to ask." I waited. "How many people have you helped over the years?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed softly. "I have no idea. More than we realized." His voice carried a weight I had never heard before. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "I think we spent a lot of years looking at the wrong things." When the conversation ended, I sat alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. His words echoed in my mind. Looking at the wrong things. That was exactly what happened. Caroline's family measured value through visibility. Titles, appearances, income, recognition. They rarely paid attention to quieter qualities like trust, credibility, loyalty, and character. Those qualities are harder to see, but they often create the foundation beneath everything else. A week later, another unexpected development occurred. Caroline asked if we could talk. We met at the dining room table where stacks of divorce paperwork had become a familiar sight. Yet this conversation had nothing to do with attorneys or legal details. She looked nervous, uncertain. It was a version of Caroline I had not seen in a very long time. "People keep telling me things," she said. "About you." I smiled slightly. "Good things, I hope." She managed a small laugh before becoming serious again. Why did I not know any of this? It was an honest question. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Honest. I considered my answer carefully. "Because you stopped being curious." The words were not intended as criticism. They were simply true. Relationships survive when people continue learning about each other. Problems begin when we decide we already know everything worth knowing. Caroline lowered her eyes toward the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy but necessary. Eventually she nodded. I could see understanding beginning to replace certainty. Not complete understanding, just the first steps toward it. As spring sunlight filled the room, I realized something important. The real revelation was not that I possessed hidden influence or valuable relationships. The real revelation was that the people closest to me never took the time to discover who I actually was. Now, months after that Christmas gathering, the same family that laughed while I signed those papers was slowly rewriting its memory of that night. What they once viewed as weakness now looked like restraint. What they once viewed as ordinariness now looked like quiet strength. And for the first time since everything began, they were finally seeing the man who had been standing in front of them all along. The weeks that followed changed Caroline more than any legal document ever could. By late spring, the divorce process was moving steadily toward completion, yet neither of us spent much time discussing attorneys or paperwork anymore. The larger conversation had already begun. It was happening quietly inside Caroline's own mind. The woman who handed me divorce papers in front of her family on Christmas Eve believed she understood exactly who I was. Now she was being forced to confront a reality that looked very different. One evening in May, we met at the house to review a final set of financial documents. The atmosphere felt surprisingly calm. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors. For a while, we worked silently. Then Caroline set down her pen and stared out the window. "I keep replaying that night," she said softly. I knew immediately which night she meant. The Christmas gathering had become a reference point for both of us. A moment frozen in memory. "What part?" I asked. She took a long breath before answering. "The way everyone laughed." The room fell silent. For months, Caroline had focused on the future. Now she was finally looking backward. "At the time, I thought everyone was supporting me," she continued. "Now I am not so sure they understood what was happening any more than I did." I listened without interrupting. Some realizations need room to breathe. Caroline looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. "I thought success was obvious," she said. "I thought I knew who was responsible for everything." There was no bitterness in her voice, only reflection. Over the following weeks, similar conversations occurred. Not often, not dramatically, just small moments where old assumptions collided with new understanding. Caroline had spent years measuring contribution through visible results. Promotions, salaries, recognition, public achievements. Like many people, she overlooked the invisible forces that make success possible. Trust, character, reputation, relationships. The more she learned about the opportunities her family received over the years, the more she began seeing those invisible forces differently. Meanwhile, her family was undergoing a similar transformation. Eric called me occasionally to ask questions about business contacts or career decisions. Melissa reached out more than once simply to thank me for introductions I made years earlier. Even Richard, who rarely expressed emotion, sent a handwritten note acknowledging things he wished he had recognized sooner. None of these gestures changed the outcome of the divorce. That was never the point. The point was understanding. Sometimes understanding arrives too late to save a relationship, but it still matters. One Saturday afternoon, I attended a community event downtown. The weather was perfect. Families filled the sidewalks. Street musicians played near outdoor cafes. As I walked through the crowd, I ran into several people I had known professionally for years. We exchanged greetings and spent time catching up. The conversations felt easy, genuine. As I drove home later that evening, I realized something important. The greatest contribution I made throughout my life was never financial. It was relational. The ability to build trust. The willingness to help people without expecting immediate rewards. The consistency to show up when others needed support. Those qualities rarely attract attention in the moment. Their value only becomes visible over time. A few days later, Caroline and I shared what would become one of our final meaningful conversations. We sat on the back patio watching the sun slowly disappear below the horizon. The air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. After several minutes, she turned toward me. "I spent years thinking I understood what made someone valuable," she said. I was wrong. There was nothing left to argue about. No defense to offer. No victory to claim. Just truth. And truth has a way of simplifying things. As darkness settled across the yard, I realized Caroline was finally seeing something that had been present all along. Not hidden power. Not secret influence. Something much simpler. The value of a person cannot always be measured by what they own, what they earn, or what others see. Sometimes the most important things a person builds are completely invisible until they are gone. And by the time Caroline fully understood that lesson, our story together was already coming to an end. By the time autumn arrived, the divorce had been finalized for several months. The legal process that once felt overwhelming had quietly faded into the background, becoming little more than paperwork stored in a filing cabinet. Life had moved forward. More importantly, I had moved forward. I eventually sold the house that carried so many memories and purchased a smaller property on the outskirts of Denver. It was not impressive by traditional standards, but it gave me something I had not felt in years: peace. Every morning began the same way. A cup of coffee on the back porch, crisp mountain air, the distant sound of birds greeting the sunrise. Those simple moments became reminders that happiness does not always arrive through achievement. Sometimes it arrives through clarity. Looking back, I no longer felt anger toward Caroline or her family. The resentment disappeared long before the divorce was finalized. Carrying bitterness requires energy, and I had no interest in spending my future trapped inside my past. What remained was perspective. The entire experience taught me something valuable about human nature. People often judge others based on what they can immediately see: titles, income, recognition, status. Very few people take the time to understand character. Even fewer take the time to understand contribution. Yet those invisible qualities often matter most. Over the following months, I occasionally heard updates through mutual friends. Caroline was doing fine. Her family was doing fine as well. Life continued, as it always does. The difference was that their understanding of me had changed forever. Several family members reached out over time. Some wanted to apologize. Others simply wanted to reconnect. I appreciated the gestures, but I never felt the need to revisit old wounds. The lesson had already been learned. One afternoon, nearly a year after that Christmas gathering, I received a handwritten letter from Caroline's father. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for several hours before I opened it. Inside was a simple message. He wrote that he regretted spending so many years measuring people by the wrong standards. He thanked me for the opportunities one had quietly created for members of the family. Most importantly, he acknowledged that they never truly understood me until it was too late. I read the letter twice before placing it back into the envelope. Then I smiled and went on with my day. Not because the apology did not matter. It did. But because I no longer needed validation from anyone. That realization felt like freedom. As winter approached once again, I found myself thinking about that Christmas Eve less and less. What once felt like the worst night of my life had become something entirely different. It became the moment the illusion ended. Had Caroline not handed me those papers in front of her family, I might have spent years living inside a relationship built on assumptions. I might have continued ignoring truths that were already visible. Instead, one painful evening forced me to see reality clearly. And reality, even when uncomfortable, is always a better foundation than illusion. Sometimes people ask whether I consider everything that happened a victory. The honest answer is no. A victory suggests someone had to lose. That is not how I see it. What happened was a lesson. A difficult lesson. An expensive lesson. But a lesson nonetheless. I learned the value of self-respect. I learned the importance of being understood by the people closest to you. Most of all, I learned that your worth is never determined by the opinions of people who do not truly know you. As I sit here today watching another sunset disappear beyond the mountains, I feel grateful. Grateful for the challenges. Grateful for the growth. Grateful for the opportunity to build a life based on truth. And before this story comes to an end, I would love to know your thoughts. If you had been sitting in that room on Christmas Eve, how would you have reacted? Would you have signed the papers and walked away? Or would you have handled things differently? Share your perspective. And if stories about resilience, dignity, personal growth, and unexpected life lessons resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this one. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not about revenge at all. Sometimes they are simply about discovering your value after everyone else failed to see it.